Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Emilio Bouza. I am the chair of the Scientific Council of the Ramon Areces Foundation, and I'd like to welcome all of you to this session entitled Forum on the Right to Global Health, or How to Deal with Upcoming Health Crisis. Foundation is hosting this in partnership with the Gaspar Casal Foundation, and I would like to particularly thank Mr. Juan del Llano, who's the director of this foundation, as well as the COVID-19 and Global Health Ambassador from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Mrs. Alicia del Llano, who's the head of Public Affairs of the Foundation, Mr. Gonzalo Fanjul, who's the Policy Director at IAS Global, and Mrs. Pilar Aparicio, who's the Director of Public Health and Quality from the Ministry of Health. And of course, I also want to greet our guest speaker today, Professor Lawrence Gostein from the Nile Institute, Georgetown University. And you are here because you're interested in this topic, and so I don't really need to say anything about why this is an important topic. Global health and future needs require a lot of things in order to be guaranteed, but one of the things that they require are the right legal framework in order to influence our decision-makers' policies. And so I think we should get on with it. And so I'm just going to once again welcome you to this venue and give the floor to Mr. Juan del Llano so he can continue with this session's introduction. I hope we will all find it enjoyable and educational. Welcome to the Ramon Areces Foundation. Good afternoon. Thank you, Emilio, for those words of introduction and welcome. I also want to thank the Ramon Areces Foundation for welcoming us again in this new joint event, which we're extremely excited about. And of course, we have tremendous expectations given the quality of the program for today's event. And COVID-19, I think, fits perfectly in Ulrich Beck's analysis in Society of Risk. Continuing with his line of thought, we live in a society which is exposed to constant risk. It's a society which is constantly overhung by an imminent threat which endangers its own existence. Who would have told us that right after we started to emerge from the COVID-19 pandemic, we would be hit by a war in Europe and with drought, as well as food security issues, antimicrobial resistance. We're really surrounded by global threats and risks, which are characterized by the fact that they are invisible, but also of incalculable impact. And also, and this is difficult from the public health perspective, they're impossible to individualize in terms of the responsibilities. And that's why these risks are defined as global, and that's why they require global governance. It's essential, therefore, to understand this concept, which should encourage us to seek an effective answer to global health threats today and in the future. And the only way to deal with global health risks is to strengthen global health as a discipline which can exert public and private leadership with knowledge and expertise. And today we are here with the father of global health, Professor Lawrence Gostein. With global health, we're able to preserve our common good or protect the general interest, which means a lot. And public health is really about, or global health is about, beginning with smaller actions in order to achieve that global aim. But if we don't start already, we might lose sight of an essential human achievement, which welfare state. And the Ramon Cajal Foundation is creating a network of knowledge to disseminate multidisciplinary knowledge with a perspective and reflexive perspective in order to define and find responses to current and future global health challenges. And international multilateral agencies must create knowledge and expertise on global health so that it can be understood by society and by politicians and policymakers. We need to define effective policies to protect global health and finally to promote global health as a public-private diplomacy instrument. Priorities of WHO and of the European Union are many and highly relevant. Before, when I mentioned global risks, I forgot perhaps the most important, which is climate change. But of course, we also have everything to do with food security, with health governance and diplomacy, with fake news, which is a huge public health problem. And that can only be managed with more critical thinking and better informed citizens. And finally, vaccines, global public good, which enable us to ensure that all citizens from all over the world will have access to them. And the fact is that we're proud from the Gaspar Casal Foundation to work in this challenge of global health. We're a think tank which has been specializing in public health for 27 years. Good evening and thank you very much. Okay. Borja, whenever you're ready. Good evening. It's a great honor to take part in this meeting with all of you. I actually have to share a small story because I was just thinking that over 20 years ago, I was 22. I was here listening to my grandfather. I think my grandfather was well known to the Ramon Areces Foundation, Dr. Segovia Arana, and I was listening to a speech on genetics and epigenetics that he was giving at that time. And I remember quite well, I was sitting there in the back with my family. And I remember that that was particularly encouraging because I understood genetics and epigenetics more in the political sense. And I thought of the traditional philosophical comparison of I am myself and my circumstances. So I is my genetics, and everything else is my circumstances. And my grandfather always said, no, actually, Borja, it's a lot longer than that and a lot more complex. But beyond that family story, which I was just remembering when I was sitting here and thinking how familiar this hall was to me, and it's been over 20 years, I want to start by thanking the Foundation for inviting me to speak here, the Ramon Areces Foundation, but also the Gaspar Casal Foundation, and especially Juan and Alicia, for their tireless dedication and constant harping on how important global health and everything around it is. And I was thinking about the right to global health and how to deal with the next health crises. And I wanted to thank the organizers and participants and everyone in the audience. And I'm sure that we're going to enjoy hearing top experts in global health, like Professor Lawrence Gostin. Our health is influenced by environmental, physical, and social factors. And that's why governments and institutions must guarantee that the optimal conditions be established for life and for people's health. And to do that, we must build knowledge, learning, adaptation, and renewal. We need to have international instruments to deal with global threats. And in this context, we welcome the initiative of establishing or trying to establish an international treaty on preparation and response for future pandemics, which will equip us with better joint effective response mechanisms. And Spain is fully committed to this effort the negotiation of this treaty, as well as amendments to the international health regulations. We also have to mitigate the impact of threats, as well as being able to prevent them. And so we must take action to guarantee global health in times of crisis and before those crises occur. And with this perspective, Spain is working on its global health strategy, whose aim is to improve health and functional capabilities and well-being of the whole of society with an equitable approach, with healthy and safe lifestyles for our citizens, and to contribute to their promotion in the international community. As you know, the Spanish global health strategy is aligned with the priorities of the European Union's global health strategy, also sponsored and promoted this last year in 2022. Better health for all in a changing world. And in this context, the Spanish strategy will be inspired and is inspired by the following principles: based on rights and equality, integration, multidisciplinary approaches, alliances for global health, multilateralism, and partnerships for global health. And we propose that we work around 5 strategic priorities from this government, including the first, to improve the health and well-being and living conditions of our citizens, to strengthen our healthcare systems and universal healthcare, to promote a global system with the One Health approach, focused on prevention, preparation, and preparedness against health threats. Fourth, an effective governance of global health through reformed and appropriately funded system. And fifth, digitization, health, research, and both basic and applied, which are the pillars of global health. This is a strategy which, I have said, follows the One Health approach, which considers human well-being in connection with the well-being of the rest of the planet. And it's the WHO which has defined global climate change as the biggest threat for humanity's health. And Spain is about to preside the Council of the European Union. And during that term, we're going to make an effort to put global health at the center of the strategy of the EU and its member states, so that we can move forward in our commitment of achieving equitable quality healthcare for all people. The COVID-19 pandemic has threatened the world's whole population, has triggered one of the most serious social, economic, and health crises we can remember. And the consequences of a global health crisis are not just health-related, but they also generate challenges in other spheres, as we have seen and experienced these last few years. And so these initiatives can serve not just to improve our citizens' health, but can also help to strengthen healthcare systems, as well as promote sustainable economic recovery so that we can achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030, guaranteeing the well-being of future generations. As Juan said before, it's not just the One Health approach, it's not just about the struggle against fake news, it's also the debate on governance for this global health architecture, and it's the effort by all governments and countries so that we can together find solutions and be prepared for potential future pandemics. Thank you.
Buenas tardes a todos. No sé si se escucha.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon and participating in this interesting discussion on global health. I'd like to start by thanking the team at the Ramon Areces Foundation for making this possible. And I'd particularly like to thank Professor Gostin for accepting the Gaspar Casal Foundation's invitation to be here with us today. 40 years ago, the link between circumstances and health was not so obvious. But now, thanks particularly to Professor Gostin's contribution, we know that the law is an essential instrument in order to have equitable access to health and in order to make progress in global health. We shouldn't forget that behind great ideas, there's always people who are driven by firm conviction and dedication, and sometimes some of those people can make their ideas become reality, which will help improve the lives of people and improve the world we live in. And that's the case with Professor Gostin. With his efforts and dedication, he's contributed to the development of a discipline, which is global health law, whose aim is to achieve a more equitable distribution of healthcare services so that we can help the most vulnerable populations in the world, inspired by the principle of social justice defined by John Rawls. He directs the O'Neill Institute for Global Health Law at Georgetown University in the US. He is a professor there at Johns Hopkins University. He's also leading the Collaboration Center of National Global Health Law of the WHO, and he's currently leading the draft of what will be the future pandemic treaty of the World Health Organization. He's been an advisor in various World Health Organization expert committees for its reform, for flu, for the sequencing of genomic data, and many others. He's also sponsored key health policies for managing pandemics like HIV, SARS, Ebola, MERS, or Zika. And he's currently advising on COVID-19 management the American government, as well as the WHO, the World Bank, and the Gavi Alliance. He's got a really extensive list of publications, but just to mention some of the most outstanding, I could mention public health law, public restraint, global health law, and the most recent in 2021, global health security, a blueprint for the future. Global health law is a reference text which has been read all over the world and has been translated in over 19 languages. But global health law, that's the topic that he's going to speak to us about today in order to open our minds and make us think so that we can be better prepared to manage current and future health crises. Es un gran honor, querido Larry, que estés aquí con nosotros. Muchísimas gracias y te doy ya la palabra. ¿Me quedo aquí sentado o lo que prefiráis?
Buenas tardes. Me siento no puedo hablar español.
Good afternoon. I'm afraid that I am not able to speak very much Spanish, but it's a great honor to have this collaboration with the Ramón Areces Foundation and the Gaspar Casal ES Global. También quiero dar las gracias a Juan del Llano, Alicia del Llano. Muchísimas gracias.
El resto de la presentación.
And the rest of my presentation will be in English, of course.
I did my best.
He hecho todo lo que he podido. ¿Me puedo quitar la chaqueta?
3 days ago, the World Health Organization celebrated its 75th anniversary. It was an historic event. I've spent a lot of time at WHO in Geneva recently, working on the pandemic treaty, and also I'm a member of the IHR, the International Health Regulations Review Committee, and I've been spending time with my dear friend Tedros, who's currently a really brilliant Director General of the World Health Organization. What I want to do is reflect on the last 75 years of the World Health Organization, look at some of its major landmarks, and then bring us to the modern day, to the COVID-19 pandemic and many of the challenges faced by the World Health Organization, and then conclude by talking about 4 transformational reforms that are taking place in Geneva and New York right now. The IHR review amendments, the pandemic accord, WHO sustainable financing, and the United Nations High-Level Threats Council. I have a paper coming out in JAMA on this shortly, and also in the BMJ Global Health, which I'll send to the foundation that they can distribute it if that is helpful. So 75 years ago, on April 7th, 1948, the United Nations formed the World Health Organization as its first specialized agency. This was a really renaissance for health and human rights in the world. In the ashes of World War II, the United Nations was formed, and 3 incredible things happened. The Charter of the United Nations, which calls for peace and security throughout the world. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which I'm proud to say that the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, was very instrumental in, and the WHO Constitution. WHO's Constitution, in its preamble, sets forth the mission of WHO, which is to attain the highest possible standard of health as a human right in the world. And in Article 1 gives the World Health Organization the mandate to be the leading organization in international health. Since that time, WHO has had stunning successes, and it's also had failures. Its very first campaign was the elimination of yaws, which was successful. It then went to tackle malaria, which had been a scourge for millennia in the world. It was unable to eradicate malaria, but it significantly reduced the number of deaths from malaria, and it's still going on. Today, WHO is still engaged in major eradication campaigns, particularly for wild polio virus and for guinea worm disease. And I should just mention, since Jimmy Carter has just gone into hospice, that President Carter, Jimmy as I know him, was really instrumental and heroic in the guinea worm eradication efforts, and made that, I think, his singular legacy. Most of the attention of the World Health Organization in its early years was devoted to infectious diseases, not surprisingly, given things like tuberculosis, malaria, and later HIV/AIDS, and the global program on AIDS, which is now morphed to UNAIDS. It's not surprising that it spends so much of its efforts on infectious diseases. But by the 1970s, WHO realized that broader health system strengthening was extraordinarily important. And so it formed the Declaration of Alma-Ata, which is a great landmark in the WHO history. This was a campaign that tried to strengthen health systems through primary care, and said that everyone had the human right to health. Through the years, WHO has not been able to maintain or fulfill the vision of Alma Ata, and that's one of its notable failures. But it's continued to try, and particularly Dr. Tedros's current triple billion goal in connection with the UN Sustainable Development Goals is very important. One of those triple billion goals is to have 1 billion more people covered by universal health coverage, which is one of the targets of the Sustainable Development Goals. And then, of course, the WHO, since late 2019, has experienced its greatest challenge in its history, the COVID-19 pandemic. Never in the world have we seen a pandemic of this sort since the 1981, what's sometimes called the Spanish flu, but isn't, is H1N1 pandemic, which was a huge killer. COVID-19, as we all know, started in Wuhan. I have another paper coming out in JAMA on the origins of COVID, and that's a real difficult history as it is. There have been essentially two prevailing theories. One is a natural zoonosis, that is a spillover event that took place in nature from an animal to a human, most likely in the Hunan wet market in Wuhan. Another theory has been a laboratory leak out of the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which is also in Wuhan, Hubei province in China. It's been a really difficult time. As I recently explained to the New York Times, the origins of COVID have been politicized like nothing I've ever seen. In fact, there was one episode where I wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post which said it was the most ruinous presidential decision in my lifetime. And that was the decision by then President Trump to announce America's withdrawal from the World Health Organization. And if one remembers that Eleanor Roosevelt was so instrumental in that, it really was a breathtaking moment. And it was caused because, principally because of the initial failures of China to accurately report SARS-CoV-2, or in that case, a novel SARS-like pneumonia. This was very troubling. In the timeline, if you go back to mid-December 2019, it was very clear to most of us, and in fact, I told a reporter in mid-December who was over at my house for tea, he was a friend, that I had heard on my WeChat from my friends that there was a novel pneumonia circulating. It was very clear that it was human-to-human spread because there was community transmission, health workers were getting sick, and yet China was reporting limited or no human-to-human transmission, and WHO was repeating that. President Trump then started doing what President Trump does the best, which is causing terrible problems in the United States and globally. I try not to be too political, but with him it's impossible because he's just such a horrible human being beyond any doubt. But he did announce at that time that WHO had sided with China in his view, which was of course wrong. And he announced his withdrawal from WHO. Joe Biden, in a little known sign of the pen, on his very first day in the Oval Office, in his very first act as president, withdrew President Trump's announcement to withdraw. Of the two prevailing theories, most scientists believe that this was a naturally occurring zoonosis. There are many reasons for that. The first is that most novel outbreaks are naturally occurring. Everything from Ebola to HIV, AIDS, to SARS-1, to MERS. They're all naturally occurring zoonotic spillovers. But also there's pretty good virological and epidemiological evidence for it. The genome sequence of the original Wuhan strain was found on feathering machines and on cages in the Wuhan market. And also, there's strong epidemiological data to show that the original outbreak began at the Hunan market. And the only evidence that I'm aware of about the Institute of Virology is simply the fact that it's nearby. They were working on bat viruses, but there's no evidence that there was an enhanced SARS-CoV-2 kind of virus that was being developed there. And so I think the preponderance of evidence, but it's still very political. President Biden recently signed into law the declassification of UN's intelligence agency reports on this, and we'll soon see the declassified reports. I expect it will only give more credence to the natural zoonosis theory. Meanwhile, Dr. Tedros developed a scientific advisory group called SAGO to investigate the origins of this and future viruses. So WHO faced enormous challenges during COVID-19. I've talked about the political ones. It found itself in the middle of a geostrategic battle between the world's great superpowers. But it also oversaw an international health regulations that were weak and countries failed to comply with them. And there were many other governance failures, particularly with vaccines and therapeutics and diagnostics and ventilators, where there was extraordinary inequity in that. I do think Tedros was the world's ethics conscience, but WHO did preside over a very inequitable distribution. Very early on, and to the credit of WHO, and in partnership with about 6 different organizations, including the Gavi Alliance, the Gates Foundation, CEPI, and others, WHO formed the ACT Accelerator, the Access to COVID Technology Accelerator, and its vaccine arm was called COVAX. It was the first time in living memory that there was an actual mechanism designed for access and affordability and equity. And it did help, but it fell short of expectations. The major reason is that the European Union, the United States, Canada, and other countries, particularly Germany and France and the United Kingdom, signed pre-purchase agreements with vaccine manufacturers, particularly messenger RNA manufacturers like Moderna and Pfizer, BioNTech. And these gobbled up the world's supplies, and so there was extreme scarcity. And today, of course, there's still an inequity, even though there's plentiful supply. But a lot has to do with public distrust in vaccines, anti-vaccine campaigns, disinformation campaigns, and also the lack of vaccine delivery infrastructure in low and middle income countries, all of which have played a major role. Now I want to turn to the future. What would it take to make a secure world? Alicia was very kind to mention my book, Global Health Security, with Harvard University Press. And the subtitle of that book is A Blueprint for the Future. It talks about how we can fortify prevention, preparedness, response, and recovery to future novel outbreaks of pandemic potential. And so I'll talk about 6 ways we can do that, and then discuss how the negotiations in Geneva are addressing these. The most important ability to respond and prepare for a novel outbreak, of course, is a robust health system. And the International Health Regulations, which is a WHO internationally binding treaty, was reformed after SARS-1 and is currently under reform more fundamentally even now with COVID. The IHR requires all countries to maintain core health system capacities for preparedness and response, including robust health systems, surveillance, laboratories, laws, response, health workforce, and other things. But most of the world has very weak systems. And that was one of the problems during the West African Ebola epidemic, which WHO was rightly highly condemned for. And it led to a change at WHO, which had previously, throughout its 75 years, always been purely a scientific and technical organization, providing technical guidance and country advice and support. But the Health Emergencies Program and the Health Emergencies Fund turned WHO into an operational organization with on-the-ground response. Currently, it's on the ground, for example, looking at hemorrhagic fevers in Africa. So most countries don't have these IHR core capacities, and there's nothing in those regulations that require countries to have external evaluations and to comply with those systems, which is one of the issues in the IHR reforms. But we also know that even countries with highly robust systems, like in the European Union, like Spain, like Italy, like the United Kingdom, like the United States, performed very badly. And interestingly, I'm also on the governing advisory board for the Global Health Security Index. And that index rated the United States first and the United Kingdom second, and European Union countries third in terms of health system preparedness, and yet they performed very badly. And that was probably because of lack of public trust, lack of public cooperation, disinformation, and the like. So we need to tackle this public trust. We need to tackle health systems. We also have problems with early reporting, as I've mentioned, with China, and also scientific sharing. Countries have been reluctant to share. China has not been, highly robust in its sharing of GSD data, but also pathogen data, as other countries have not as well. And there are perverse incentives. As you can recall, perhaps, when the Omicron virus variant was first identified, it wasn't identified in the United States. Thank you, that was lovely. It was identified in South Africa. Immediately, the European Union, the United States, most countries in the world, instead of rewarding South Africa, slapped on travel and trade restrictions. So you had perverse incentives. The other issue, of course, is the equity issue, which I've already talked about, with the deep inequities. These inequities transpired both within countries and among countries. The New York Times just reported, I think 2 days ago, of a reduction, a stunning reduction in life expectancy in 2020 and 2021 in New York City. It was something like a loss of nearly 3 years or 4 years of life expectancy in just those 1 or 2 years. But it turns out that for white New Yorkers, it was 2 years loss of life expectancy. For Latino and Latinas, it was 7 years. And for African Americans, it was 10 years. So there's huge disparities. And we saw that in many countries around the world. For example, indigenous populations in Brazil and other places. So equity was a big issue. Funding was also a large issue about how we finance these things. And then there's the issue of One Health. One Health was referred to earlier. I was very pleased and delighted to see the government of Spain embracing this One Health approach. It's basically an interdisciplinary approach which posits that the only way you can prevent and prepare and respond is through animal health, human health, and a healthy environment. And so there are concrete legal steps we could take to prevent, for example, natural zoonotic spillovers. We can reduce climate emissions so that habitat for animals and mosquitoes and others aren't constantly shifting. We can have land use policies that prevent deforestation, that cause humans and animals to cohabit much more closely. We can regulate wet animal markets, probably ban them even. We can regulate enhanced function research, or what's called dual use research. And we can ensure that countries comply with all of their legal obligations. So those are the kinds of things we need: strong health systems, scientific sharing, early reporting, equity, financing, and One Health. So how do these play out in the four major diplomatic efforts that are ongoing today in Geneva and in New York? Well, first, of course, is the international health regulations. As a member of the IHR Review Committee, our report came out recently. There's now a member state working group on the IHR negotiating. There were proposals by virtually every country in the world, because the European Union put in, the African Union, the United States, Russia, a whole range of countries put in amendments. And so we're painstakingly going through them. The main points of contention are between issues of compliance and implementation, accountability and transparency, and also scientific sharing and equity. Everybody believes that we need scientific sharing, and everybody believes that we need equity. But for the global north, the European Union and the United States, scientific sharing is most important. But for the global south, particularly the African Union, who we've been working with, I've been playing at both sides. I'm working with the EU, I'm working with the White House, and I'm working with the AU, trying to get them all together. For them, they want equity. And the problem is that this has become transactional. So the global south won't give the global north scientific sharing as a norm unless the global north gives the global south equitable access. And that's a sticking point. And I've been trying to, my own view is that I can understand why there's this transactional character, but nonetheless, both are important and we can't trade one off against the other. And we have to find a way to do both. When I've talked to the White House, they tell me, and I believe them, that they understand they have to do something very serious about equity. But whether they'll go so far as to interrupt intellectual property protection, for example, or really have knowledge transfer and technology transfer and manufacturing in countries like India, South Africa, Brazil, outside of the major northern countries. Whether that will happen, I don't know. President Biden, for example, for the first time in American history, as far as I know, said that the United States would not try to enforce intellectual property protection against COVID-19 vaccines. And he made that clear to the World Trade Organization, but the European Union said no. So you have a very complex set of diplomatic negotiations going on, and it's very, very hard to see how that's going to play out. Well, I do think there's going to be, and there has been in Geneva, major progress on the IHR. The pandemic treaty, or what's called, what WHO calls CA+. It's called Convention Agreement Plus. If anybody wants me to explain that, I will. But for our purposes, I'll just call it the pandemic treaty. Negotiations have been very arduous. Just last week, the Intergovernmental Negotiation Body, the INB, met for its 5th time in Geneva. It was the first time that it actually negotiated the terms of the so-called zero draft, and it didn't make a lot of progress. I'm very confident that there will be a pandemic treaty, extraordinarily confident, but I'm not as confident about how robust the norms and standards will be. And I'm also not as confident about how many countries will sign on. I don't think the United States will, although the Biden administration has not said that, and they're negotiating very strongly and in good faith. Pam Hashimoto, who is a very experienced UN diplomat, has been designated by the State Department and the Department of Health and Human Services to be our lead negotiator. And so what will happen with those two instruments, I don't know, but I do know that the IHR is the most adopted and widely endorsed international treaty on earth. It has 196 states parties. So we need to make that strong, and we need to make the pandemic treaty robust. You know, I've been in meetings with member states in Geneva at WHO headquarters, and I hear countries say no, or waffle, or how can we do this? They talk about processes, delays, sovereignty. And I get up and I look at, and they say we can never do One Health. And I get up to them and I look at them and I say, listen, just forget about all the diplomacy and the negotiations. Just between you and me, we know this has to happen. And we know this has to be bold. This is our one shot, our only chance that we're ever going to have in our lifetimes to really make a difference. And I think history will judge us. So there's the IHR and the pandemic treaty. The third big thing was sustainable financing for the World Health Organization itself. I don't think it's well known that WHO's annual budget is less than the annual budget of one single US teaching hospital. It's got less than 1/4 of the budget of the US CDC and 1/10 or 1/20 of the NIH. So it needs more money, which it's not getting. But it also needs more control, because currently about 20% of all WHO funding is within WHO's control. All the rest of it is called earmarked or discretionary or voluntary spending, which means that donors get to make the decision, whether it's the Gates Foundation, the European Union, UK, Australia, Norway. They're making the decisions about what WHO can or cannot do. So the wonderful thing is that in the last World Health Assembly, they decided to incrementally increase the mandatory, or what we call assessed contributions to WHO incrementally up to 50%, which has been an historic value but hasn't been seen for many years. So WHO financing is the third big thing. And the fourth is a high-level threats council. Most of us realize that WHO is indispensable, but nonetheless, you need high-level political engagement when you have really serious global threats. So the IPPR in Geneva has called for a high-level council, probably at the UN level. The UN itself has called for a UN-level council. WHO would like the council to be at the executive committee and at the World Health Assembly level. And so whether we're going to see this high-level council is unknown, but there are lots of efforts going on in both Geneva and New York to make this possible. So we're now 75 years into the World Health Organization's history, and I believe that we're at a pivotal moment WHO is at a crossroads. It's negotiating for transformational reforms. And depending upon how audacious, how bold we are, whether or not we're going to see robust health systems, free and open transparency and sharing of scientific information, equity, financing in One Health. That's for us. We need to push. Civil society needs to push. Governments need to push. The Director General needs to push. The Secretary General, the UN General Assembly. Because if we don't do it now, we're going to go back to the theme of my book, which is that we lurch from complacency to panic and then back to complacency. Now is our time to break that vicious cycle and to do something not just for ourselves, but for our children and for our grandchildren. Muchas gracias.
Sí. ¿Cuánto tiempo tenemos, Alicia?
Yo creo que media hora casi.
Media hora tanto, sí. Ah, vale.
Did I go too long?
No. Pero podemos acabar antes.
Muy bien, pues.
Very good. Thank you very much, Professor Ghostin. That was fascinating, a very interesting presentation. You dealt with many issues and topics. In the program, I'm supposed to reach conclusions, but not really. I'd like to ask a few questions for a dialogue with the professor, since he has so kindly and graciously displaced himself to Madrid. When you talked about law and health, I thought about a Spanish, famous Judge Philip Sanz. You know about him? He's my good friend. Okay. Well, so he's a legal expert. He's written many books, West and East Street, and the evolution of concepts of genocide and crimes against humanity. And the most recent book has now been published in Spain. It's The Last Colony. And in this book, he is discussing a case of a small archipelago near the Maldives and the right of the population exiled by the British Empire back in the time and the right to return. The details are relevant, but what I underscore is that Philip Sanz pours his love for health law into every page. It's the barrier that sets civilization from the jungle. And in the One Health concept, we have this concept. Law should be this firewall between civilization and the jungle. And the right to health, as it is recognized in the Magna Carta of Human Rights, is an unwaverable right and connected to other fundamental rights of human beings. And during the time of COVID-19, we have experienced quite brutally and savagely how personal security, personal economy, safety, and the economy was highly dependent on very abstract and aspirational factors, such as, for example, the strength of our healthcare system, universal coverage, and the possibility that the law back up everything so that it may become a reality. That's why I'm particularly interested in the approach you give to this matter.
And the second topic I'd like to bring up to get this dialogue going is the fact that we've talked a lot about COVID-19, infectious diseases, the International Pandemic Treaty, but as you suggested in your presentation, this is a much bigger challenge than all that. We've spoken about the all risks approach, and here, as Juan mentioned in his introduction, We speak about biochemical accidents, bioterrorism, and also conflicts, which is something we've experienced in the past, but also about things which until very recently seemed impossible and which are now in the political arena, such as the possibility of a nuclear attack or even just a nuclear disaster like the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power station in the Ukraine, and the huge existential threat of climate change and environmental risks in general. And that challenge, what that requires is a legal, political, economic governance structure which we lack today, or is at least very imperfect, or still very much to be completed or defined. And that is, in my view, the context for this dialogue. And the institutions which participate in the debate on global health, governments, health ministries which are working in this sphere, they're all facing a similar challenge with, of course, very different levels of resources, but very similar challenges. And so what I'd like to do is to start with a question, which I hope is not going to push you out of your comfort zone, but it has a lot to do with the window of opportunity for this discussion. At the end of your presentation, you spoke about the risk of returning to a time of complacency. And I think what we experienced during the pandemic was a very exceptional time when everyone was all too aware of why global health is such a crucial determining factor in our lives. But now that's being forgotten very quickly. And in the current geopolitical context with growing division, if things were difficult during COVID, they're even more difficult now with more or less open confrontation between China and the US, and certainly Russia and the rest of the world, and the alignment of countries on different sides in a way we hadn't seen since the Cold War, and also in a context, as Pablo also mentioned, where fake news and the information wars are becoming increasingly toxic, and it's really difficult to have an informed dialogue with all this fake news, but also this avalanche of information where it's really hard to tell what's accurate from what it's not and what's true from what it's not. And so my first question for you is, to what extent does this window of opportunity still exist, and how can we strengthen it and open it further in order to achieve tangible political consequences or impacts in the short and medium term?
Such a rich and set of questions, not just one. Many questions. I was actually the head of the Civil Liberties Organization in the UK with Margaret Thatcher when she attacked the Las Malvinas. And so colonialism is a very substantial issue in global health today. So I just wanted to begin by saying that. And of course, you know, the great colonial empires, Spain, the United Kingdom, and others, France, have had large adverse impacts in Africa. The other issue that you mentioned was that it's not just infectious diseases and global health security. And I think that that's absolutely true. There are a couple of things about COVID-19 that we don't often reflect on, but we should. One of them you discussed very elegantly, which is the larger impacts. I mentioned excess deaths and lower increased rates of morbidity and mortality and decreased life expectancy. And while SARS-CoV-2 was a very important part of that, it was actually much more complex. It was people that health systems were so overstretched that people delayed diagnoses for cancer, heart disease. They didn't get treated for diabetes. So we saw a very large rise in excess deaths from non-communicable diseases. We also saw enormous economic impacts. And now with the war in Ukraine, food security combined with COVID. So you had wider health system impacts with NCDs. You had huge economic impacts, as we all know, food and the like. But we also had major impacts that will affect the next generation in terms of loss of educational opportunity. Children didn't go to school. All of these things, I think, are forgotten with COVID-19, and we need to kind of get back to global health in many dimensions and not just with infectious diseases. I agree with you wholeheartedly that I worry very much that the window of opportunity from COVID-19 is closing rapidly, and people have forgotten already. In fact, in some ways, the attacks on public health and the attacks on science are greater now than they've ever been. All of the, I don't know, I'm sure you've been following all of the controversy over the Cochrane studies on the efficacy of mask use, for example, would be one. But we're continuing to, see this dialogue that public health scientists got it wrong. Tony Fauci, for example, is a very good friend, and he's been pilloried in the United States. So I don't know whether or not we're going to be able to seize this moment after COVID. But I think that if we don't, shame on us. Because after all the world has suffered with loss of life, with huge economic impacts, food insecurity, education of our children, the social interactions that children have, a generation growing up as COVID children, all of these things, if we don't respond in a bold and creative way to all of that human suffering, including addressing climate change and One Health, then I think, I don't like to say this, humankind deserves what it gets.
Right.
Because we know what's to come. We have the tools to prevent it, and we're just not.
But let me switch to English because I think it's going to be easier for the conversation in the. But coming back to this point, there was this fascinating article by Danny Roderick and Stephen Walk in Foreign Affairs about what new forms of governance we can afford in this period of geopolitics. And they made this point that rather than aspiring to have a full-fledged multilateral system covering every single issue, we should learn to live with the possibility of having a series of topics that are under a strong and ambitious global governance and others that are simply not. And among those topics, they mention explicitly global health as one of the issues where there is a mutual interest, even in the context of a commercial war between the United States and China. There is, from your experience, from your real life, realpolitik experience in the negotiations, do you think that this is possible, that it is possible to have? Do you think that despite of the conflict with Russia, Russian and American delegates or Russian and European delegates would be able to sit around a table right now to discuss the pandemic treaty?
Very good question, and I know the answer, but I don't know if I'm at liberty to say. But I think I can. You know, I've been told at high levels in the White House that even though conversations with China are almost non-existent right now. In fact, there's more high-level political dialogue between the United States and Russia than there is with China. And I noticed that Macron just went to Beijing. But they say that on the health issues that they have been on the pandemic treaty and on the IHR, they have been discussing it. Russia actually put in a very substantial series of amendments of the IHR, and they weren't that bad. They were actually pretty good. So I think on the health issue, I do think it's possible for the EU, China, and Russia, and the United States to have conversations. And it may be the only area where they can have conversations, because right now, high-level diplomacy, I mean, on questions of, say, nuclear or armed engagement between these three countries and NATO, the channels of high-level communication are thin. I mean, President Biden literally cannot pick up a phone and speak directly and quickly to Xi Jinping, nor can Anthony Blinken to his counterpart. That's a very dangerous situation. But I think on the health, I'm a little bit more optimistic. I've seen it. In the IHR negotiations, China and Russia were both in the room, but I'm not at liberty to say how. Yeah,
absolutely. Let me ask you about the position of the global South, to put it in very general terms, or developing, particularly poorer countries. We saw during the pandemic that the response was so late, particularly in terms of the global immunization, that basically many people in the global South lost interest. I'm talking about Africa in particular, for instance, or some of the poorest countries. There is this saying that first you need the vaccine, then you need the doctors, and you need the arms, no? And then we lost the arms because people were simply, and to a certain extent, it is difficult to blame them when for many years they've been paying the price of the other pandemics, of malaria, TB, HIV, of forgotten diseases, and somehow their agenda has been sidelined and continues to be sidelined. No? And I wonder if this is something that you think that, because I want to move to the WHO now, that could build the legitimacy of the global health system to try to expand its interest beyond what the global north is worried about. No?
Very important. It's probably the most important. There are a lot. The Director General is the first African, right. And WHO did form the ACT Accelerator, but it hasn't done enough. And so I think basically the African Union, I speak with them regularly, and even WHO Africa CDC, but also countries like India, Bangladesh, Indonesia. I think they take they have a few positions that I think have hardened. The first one is, in my view, and I've said this publicly in my writing, I think the era of philanthropy, charity, global aid or assistance is over. They don't want that anymore because they know that donations always come too little, always come too late. So they want the ability to manufacture themselves, diversified manufacturing. And that's a complex and costly thing. If they first have to have the scientific infrastructure, the manufacturing infrastructure. They need much more freedom from intellectual property restraints. And they need what's been called now diversified manufacturing or technology transfer. And so a company like Moderna, which I think has been it's a complex company because on the one hand, they did create a magnificent vaccine and saved hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lives. And they did say that they would not enforce their patents, but they've been very greedy. And they've refused to share the technology. And so WHO is now trying to support and fundraise for, as you know, mRNA hubs. Basically, these are facilities. The first one was in South Africa, I think, near Cape Town. But they want them in different parts of the world so that they can produce their own global goods and not wait. But that's going to be a very heavy lift. I can talk a lot about that. The other thing is that they really do not want to give anything to the global north unless they get what they want. Right. This kind of transactional thing, they feel this is their only leverage, you know, in the negotiations, that they have to, that unless they agree, unless the North agrees to something very meaningful in their view, they don't want to agree to share viral samples, GSD, report early, provide something like South Africa did with early notification and genetic sequencing of the whole Omicron variant. They want to withhold all that until they get it. So these are the things that are very difficult. The other thing that the African Union complains about a lot, and I understand it, that's why we're helping them, is that if you go to Geneva with these 3 or 4 negotiations I talked about, particularly the 2 major ones, the US, the EU will have dozens, if not hundreds, of negotiators and mission heads and mission assistants, and Africa just can't provide that kind of capacity in both New York and in Geneva. So there are a lot of stress points at the moment. I very much hope that we're going to be able to get through it.
Do you think that, for instance, the African CDC has increased their game after the pandemic, that they are now better prepared to participate in the global conversation?
Yes.
Yeah.
Are they prepared enough? No.
No, yeah, of course.
But are they better prepared? Yeah, I mean, frankly, they were just a shell before the pandemic.
Right.
Now they've got, you know, now they're part of, they're a relevant stakeholder.
Right.
Yeah.
Let me talk a little bit about the question of the WHO reform, because it's something that is really interesting, and I wonder if you could expand a little bit on the specific and more realpolitik binding constraints right now, because when it comes to financing, I mean, the numbers you have mentioned, to be frank, this is a ridiculous conversation. I mean, the minute main donors or any country, I mean, they decided to change the financing structure as they did, this would change like in a second, no? And So there is a political conversation taking place, and I know that the U.S. government during the Trump administration made a caricature of the position of Director Tedros. But what are, in your view, the problems right now? Because it's always mentioned the balance between a truly democratic organization and an organization that is safe enough for the powers in the.
I see. Yeah. Well, you've raised two or three actually very important questions. If I made it cover them all. The first one is WHO funding itself, what's called sustainable financing. They did make a major stride, as I've explained, with the incremental increase to 50% of assessed contributions, but there was no movement on the overall budget. And that's one issue. WHO's control over its budget and the amount of its budget. The second issue is global health financing writ large. The World Bank has the pandemic facility, and it's underfunded now. We've had a lot of conversations in Geneva about whether the pandemic treaty or the IHR should link in its funding to the bank. But there's concern about that because the bank doesn't have a very good track record. Remember Jim Kim's pandemic preparedness fund that just collapsed. Absolutely. The current one doesn't look like it's going to collapse, but it's also very underfunded, and we don't know how long it's going to. So pandemic funding is the second one. The third one is WHO governance itself. WHO is a paradox because it has. It's the only world health democracy, one nation, one vote, but it has many governance deficits and failures. One of the biggest ones, I think, is the failure to engage non-state actors, or more to the point, civil society, because it engages with the Gates Foundation and others, and corporations. And I think it's just an own goal for WHO to behave that way, because it gets no support from the public or from civil society. Whereas the civil society will fight their governments to support UNAIDS or the Global Fund in its replenishment, but they won't lift a finger for WHO because there's no voice. And that's something that I've been highly critical of WHO on for a long, long time, but very little movement.
Right. And if I may ask, do you think that the big private-public organizations and the new organizations that have played an absolutely pivotal role in global health, from the donors like the Gates Foundation to the Global Fund and Gavi and others, do you think in this particular challenge of the WHO reform that they are helping or that they are an obstacle?
Depends who you ask.
Well, I'm asking you.
I mean, I've been, for example, the Gates Foundation, I've been very critical of the Gates Foundation, but I wouldn't want the world without all the money that they put in.
Absolutely.
So it's complex. I do not think that, although Bill Gates acts like he's a global health expert, I don't regard him as that.
Right.
But undoubtedly, the ground is shifted from below WHO's feet. Throughout its entire history, it was the only game in town. The World Bank, did work on AIDS and poverty reduction and things like that. But basically, it's been a whole new world with UNAIDS, the Global Fund, Gavi, CEPI, UNITAID, all of the big global public-private partnerships. Even the ACT Accelerator is really not WHO's. It's a combination of all those actors that I talked about. So that means that WHO has kind of been left behind. They're now just one of many partners. It's very difficult for me to say that Gavi and CEPI and the Global Fund haven't been a force for good.
Right.
I think they have been, undoubtedly. And their governance structures are better. They're more nimble, they're more flexible, they get things done. And that's good for public health. If it's good for global public health, it should be good for WHO, but there's tension.
Yeah, it depends on what, because sometimes it seems that they do not trust the WHO.
No, and the bank as well, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay.
Yeah.
Alicia, I think it's 7:30. I don't want to go, but I'm really grateful. I really enjoyed your presentation, and this conversation with you.
Thank you. It's a wonderful conversation.
Thank you so much, Larry. Si os parece bien, damos paso a la clausura.
If you agree, we're just going to go ahead and close the session. Go ahead, Pilar.
Buenas tardes, queridos amigos.
Okay, good evening, dear friends, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. I'd like to start by greeting my dear Professor Emilio Bouza, who's taught me so much. I'd also like to thank dear Borja, our Ambassador of Global Health, such an important mission. And I, of course, also want to thank Juan del Llano for his invitation. Also want to thank the Areces Foundation and the Casal Foundation for hosting this event. And of course, Professor Gostin for giving this extraordinary lecture. And thank you also, Gonzalo, for those questions and the discussion. When I thank the Ministry of Health when I thank the organizers for inviting the Ministry of Health to be present in this conference, I think it's a great opportunity for the Ministry of Health also to reflect not just the work that we've been doing together in Spain in order to define a global health strategy as part of the efforts that are being made internationally to respond to this need for global health governance, but also because I think there's a crucial element, as Professor Gostin pointed out when he spoke about the importance of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. When it refers to health, it refers to food, clothing, housing, healthcare, and social services. Clearly, when we speak about law and health, these are concepts that are inextricably linked, because the protection of health requires strong protection, enforcement, and strong laws. And I think the pandemic has taught us a lot, unfortunately, at a tremendous cost for all of our societies. But I think, first of all, it has taught us that in spite of all of our development, we have a clear global vulnerability which we cannot overlook. And clearly, that vulnerability has manifested in all countries, in the most developed, richer countries, but also in the least developed. And also, as Professor Gostin also pointed out, it is obvious that it has not affected all countries equal, and it has not affected all people within each of these countries equally. Like any other crisis, the pandemic has shown that vulnerability is an essential determining factor in our ability to respond to a crisis. And speaking about our government, of course, what we need is to have a state of law focused on the citizens' well-being in order to be prepared to respond to these crises.
And to talk in principle about our own country, obviously we do have to draft a powerful and stringent regulation and legislation. We're talking about healthcare protection. I'm talking about healthcare, but I started saying how all determinants in society and lifestyle will have an impact on people's health. And so now we are very lucky to have a regulation in our country starting in 1986 with the Healthcare General Act, and through the different tenures has been amended and added to, such as, for example, the law of disability 1963, the common portfolio of all regional services of healthcare, the public law of 2011, and the very extensive and detailed regulation that we have developed during the pandemic in order to give a response to the different stages of the pandemic. So, even though it's true that the change in regulation has made it possible to build a national healthcare system that is very powerful, going back to 1986, and it's true, during the pandemic, we could see its weak points and flaws, but the response to the pandemic didn't come only from the healthcare sector, although it was the one to suffer the most, particularly by the lives of the professional healthcare workers. I have a quote from Professor Hortalejo that I heard in a debate with Gaspar Casal Foundation, said that the response to the pandemic in Spain, one of the most important elements, in fact, the most important to him was the possibility of applying temporary dismissal regulation so that workers could stay at home but not lose their jobs, and then avoid contacts with third people to avoid the propagation of the virus. So the special permission called ERTES in Spain, and that the occupational leaves of absence were going to be paid as if they're working during the quarantine period because they were forced to be at home because of a close contact with somebody infected, could also have the right, the legal right to receive compensation during the leave of absence for quarantine. And all this was essential. And obviously, not all countries dealt with the situation strongly as us, because they didn't have social services as strongly developed as we did, and we don't have the regulation for economic and equity of access to healthcare in other countries. And this, I believe, outlines the global healthcare strategy. The people who spoke before me have mentioned the key elements of the global healthcare strategy, because as we saw before, the sustainable development goals of the United Nations, such as number 3, will go hand in hand with the other ODS to achieve this better level of health in the population at large. And there are some elements outside the scope of law, but also influence law about health and the right to global health. I was telling you with Professor Boza, we talked about it, that in a record time, the scientific community has identified the microorganism very soon. In a few days, they had the diagnostic tool developed, and not only at the epicenter where the pandemic started, but the diagnostic tool was employed, we knew 27 December, in a typical systematic at 6 day, the microorganism, and on 10 the sequence. And in powerful laboratory countries and rich countries, we had the possibility of identifying the virus, as we did in Spain, for example. And that was the first case we had in our country at the end of the month, the same month, January 2020. uncertainty. This coordination and exchange of scientific knowledge has been essential, a fundamental key. And it is also associated to a very clear regulation. One of the great lessons that we learned from the pandemic has been the possibility, the potential ability for the European Union to respond to a healthcare crisis. It's true that in the beginning it was difficult by the CDC to determine and establish what type of crisis we were dealing with and what were the characteristics. Of course, it was very difficult on a joint basis for all countries and for all scientists all over the world, but nevertheless, once the first few months had lapsed by, and because of the catastrophe we had, the scarcity of supply of basic equipment for protection and fighting the pandemic, the European Union, through its mechanism to support coordinated actions for different molecules that would allow them to have a record-time vaccine development, supported decidedly in the joint purchase by the European Union in this investment before the vaccines were developed. Quite clearly, it was a decided support by the European Union and in all countries by an equity standard. They will have equal access to them, and also with sufficient technological ability to participate in the different mechanisms WHO that Professor Costin was mentioned for the distribution of the vaccines. So at least we did learn a few lessons. So concerning healthcare regulations or outside the strictly speaking healthcare area, internationally they always point at governance. We have considered the key elements. The ambassador has been describing the elements that are under discussion now in the global health strategy for Spain. Nevertheless, I do have to propose a few elements. I think that international health regulation should be well implemented in all countries, but obviously inequalities from a social and economic point of view have made it impossible, and during the pandemic they were not implemented with the full ability to detect any transfrontier threat. Now they're working internationally to try to improve the IHR, but it's true that it's sort of a basis that the WHO, as Professor Costin said, is celebrating 75th anniversary, is a kind of element, take into account politics, multilateralism, try to respond global healthcare problems in the population, but it is true that there are other elements to take into account which are decisive in global health, and I want to point them out because they're very relevant. We've talked about the discussions we're holding right now as to the pandemic treaty, the platform of non-pharmacological countermeasures, everything about governance, preparedness, and response and recovery has been discussed as to relates to emergencies, but I think there are also international efforts that deserve praise because they address the vulnerability of different countries and specific populations in each country. There are different initiatives based on international agreements. They talk about convention of the parties on the environment, where the environment and healthcare are increasingly important in their relationships. And the other one has to do with tobacco. What does tobacco have to do with healthcare emergencies? Well, it does have to do with chronic respiratory diseases have suffered a greater mortality and morbidity with COVID than non-smokers. And obviously, the pandemics due to respiratory pathogens, especially those that have a rapid transmission ability and that have, amongst many other things, an involvement of the lungs, well, obviously, it is related to chronic smoking. And there is a new regulation to link WHO to other countries to have an agreement on tobacco and tobacco fight. And it will bear a very decided and long-reaching impact on the health of the population, and will improve in the long run the global health. We talked about the climate and its relationship with healthcare. I don't need to insist any further. And we have mentioned something. I want to give another example of governance worldwide, the multilateralism. We talked about advancing towards One Health, the health of the planet, the climate, the environment, the setting, human and animal health, and the relationship is very important. I remember at the G20 first debates that I could attend in 2018, and there was always the point of global threat pointed out, the antimicrobial resistance, and they already considered back then the approach One Health. We started in 2018, and all the countries of G20 were agreed in having a common policy for One Health, including animal husbandry, agricultural, human care, everything, to approach bacterial multi-resistance in the widest scope. We have had initiatives concerning One Health and antimicrobial resistance. Now, the G20 countries have agreed. They're not small, obviously. They account for 80% of the world economy and more than 60 or 70% of the world's population. So now, at least they have agreed that One Health is one of the priorities to deal with global health. I don't want to take too long and strain your patience, but global governance always has to reflect national governance and corresponding levels. So all developed countries have a very important commitment to less economically developed countries, with less social development and with less development of the healthcare system, to cooperate in the social, economic, and healthcare point of view. They have the duty to improve and help these countries in response to an emergency or a crisis. Professor Gosting was pointing out strengths and weaknesses not only of the individual countries' response, but also multilaterally and within the World Health Organization. And it's true, but if we didn't have an institution like WHO, we would have many problems when discussing international governance, and we would make evidence many of the flaws. It's very difficult, and I agree, to separate financing from policy, from mandates. Nevertheless, it is also true that thanks to these discussions, we advance and progress in these essential and fundamental topics. I'd like to close by pointing out that has been referred to during this debate held here at the Ramon Areces Foundation. It is true that we need a state with the rule of law, nationally, internationally powerful legislation that guarantee the best health care and protection for all citizens, taking into account not only health problems, but also the different factors determining health and associated to it, so that we foster the best way to overcome the problems. I think that the effort undertaken by the European Union, not only for its global strategy or the reinforcement of the CDC mandate and the reinforcement of the EMA mandate and strategies and a new IHR regulation, the threats, the transborder threats, and this concept of Salud Health Europe that wants to have connectivity with health data. With all these initiatives, we will have a fair and more equal Europe. I think it showcases how Europe should project beyond its frontiers and widen its policies to the rest of multilateral countries. So once again, thank you very much indeed to the Ramon Areces Foundation and the Casal Foundation for holding this meeting and this debate. And thank you very much, my dear friends. Thank you very much indeed.